Tulagi, and you just sardined in there and hopped up and down with your pitcher and listened to Flash Cadillac. And they had this drummer, this guy behind the kit, who was doing just about anything he could to get a rise out of the crowd. Anyone who saw Harold back then saw genius. I mean, the guy was the funniest entertainer I've ever seen.
And this was when everybody's growing along here and playing psychedelic music, so, you know, being a very progressive sort, decided to do 50s music. No clue why. I think it may be an, you know, overdose of Coors. We're going to have everybody get short hair or grease their hair back, wear 1950s clothes, and do dance steps on stage. Looked around to try and find some people who would be Flash Cadillac, and I talked to Tommy Bolin first and asked him if he wanted to play in a band and grease his hair back and do the dance steps and play 50s music. And of course his hair was red and green and blue and was below his shoulders, and he had less than no interest in this. Then I talked to Jock Bartley, who I knew from the dorms, and Jock said, you know, he would think about playing the music and everything, but he really didn't want to cut his hair. And then I remembered a friend from the dorms, and I said, do you know how to play guitar? And he said, sure. I said, can you sing? He said, sure. And I said, do you want to be Flash Cadillac? He goes, oh, sure. This was Mick Menres.
Man, I'll never forget seeing Flash and going, wow, these guys, I mean, it was over the top.
Flash Cadillac was, you know, 15 years ahead of anyone jumping backwards. And they were jumping backwards to the 50s. And it was rock and roll. Previous to rock was rock and roll. And rock and roll was, you know, pre-pot, and it was booze-based, and it was about making teenagers crazy. And they had a good formula for doing that. They had a thing where they would drink chocolate milk and orange juice and hawk up on the ceiling, and they would put $200 bets on when it would hit the drums. They were presenting the Belushi thing a little early.
I think it seemed like it was a good excuse for people to get completely stupid and not worry about it, entirely non-cerebral. And it became gross night, and people would start lining up in the afternoon to get in. They'd be lined up along the street to get in, and then, you know, we would have to get grosser and grosser and do more and more rude stuff. So we'd do this twist contest, and it started off with people just twisting, and then eventually it got to the point where someone would take off an item of clothing. And then it reached the point where it was basically skin to win. That was it. No skin, no win. So we would start the twist contest, and people would start going, skin, 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 skin. Instead of people starting the twist contest and then taking their clothes off, they would start naked. So you would look out on the dance floor, and you have 20 or 30 couples nude, completely nude. So now, if everybody's nude, you know, how do you win? So now people have to start doing some interesting things to each other.
They just would zing each other, zing the crowd, give away a tuna as a prize for the twist contest, a big stinky fish, or a fender off of a 57 Chevy. I mean, just lunacy, sweet lunacy, but totally over the top. The hard part was when they tried to take it to the next level. It was really hard on the band because you're playing in Boulder to all the frats at the same place as Tulagi and the Sink on Tuesday night or whatever. It was a tailor-made audience ready to do whatever he told them to. Going to a Holiday Inn in Lodi, California or whatever and trying to get the same response, you know, it just couldn't happen the same way.
I happened to just kind of go into the buff room, which was downstairs on the hill there, to see a band that nobody had heard of called Ethereal Zephyr. It was Kenny, Dave, and a couple other people. And that was the first day that Tommy Bolin had just come in from out of state and was kind of brought his guitar, and he sat in with them. And everybody in the whole place, including Kenny and David, were like, this kid could play. He was like 17 years old and just a monster player.
When Kenny and David got with them, they got John Ferris, and they were hot. Ferris was kind of the genius of the whole band. I always thought he was the artsy guy, you know. Tommy was the power player. You could hum a tune, and Tommy could play it. And he had little stubby, he had pretty hands, he had little stubby hands. And he had that little high voice, you know, Tommy, you know, if you ever heard him talk. Tommy was not an androgynous person, but I think he had an androgynous look.
He looked kind of like Eddie Van Halen, and he was into his kind of harder rock days. It was right before he went on with Deep Purple and the James Gang.
Zephyr always got comparisons to Janis Joplin and Big Brother and the Holding Company. They had Candy Gibbons out front, who was arguably a better singer in terms of finesse. Certainly Janis could belt it and had that raw emotive power, but Candy could sure bring it too.
Candy really didn't get her just dues. She was one of the most incredible blues women harp players and never got any recognition for that.
When Tommy left the band, Candy and David still had a record deal, so I replaced Tommy Bolin in Zephyr and made their third album, which was Sunset Ride.
I played with Jock when I joined Zephyr. It was Jock, Danny Smith, John Ferris, Candy and David. That's when I played electric mandolin.
When Tommy and Candy were in the band, they had some personalities who, you know, tried to dominate the stage, but it was almost like Candy and Tommy were vying for who got the spotlight.
You saw those guys live, it was electric. It was just the best kept secret in the Mountain Time Zone. Unfortunately, that band got lost in the shuffle.
Tommy Bolin was alive today, he'd be Eric Clapton. But he was, you know, he had some problems and he never could overcome them, and then the drugs killed him.
Zephyr, R-O-C-K, it rocked. Yeah.
I'm getting out to walk up the aisle at the Basemar Center. I have to stop and wait while a guy is changing the diaper of his baby on the floor. And who is it but Richie Furay?
We came here because Rusty Young and George Grantham both grew up in Colorado. I didn't need to be in the Los Angeles scene. So when I wrote Good Feeling to Know, after traveling around and always being in the cities, you know, to get back home and to see the Colorado mountains, and it was really home. And I think that's what, you know, what that song really meant to me in my heart, man. It was home. It was a place to settle down. This is where, you know, I'll call it a day. So Colorado mountains, I can see your distant sky. You know, just it's bringing a tear to my eye. Colorado was becoming a music scene. Jim Guercio had just established Caribou Ranch. The Dirt Band moved to Colorado. Of course, Steve Stills had a place not too far from here. Chris Hillman had moved here. Well, Joe Walsh lived downtown.
Dan Fogelberg had moved to Colorado. There was a whole scene of really hip musicians, and it was like a happening place. Tulagi's had gone bankrupt and was empty. Herbie bought Tulagi's, and we opened up with Tommy Bolin and Zephyr. We had some tremendous stuff, and that became one of the main stops in the whole rock circuit in the early 70s, Boulder, Colorado. Bonnie Raitt played there.
Every time Bonnie comes through town, here in the modern era, she still references her days back at Tulagi. And such a sweetheart. After every show, she'd grab a broom and help us sweep up the shells and cups. And I love her to this day for that. No other act even came close to getting near the janitorial servicing with us. I served 3-2 beer to Don Henley and Glenn Fry, me 18 years old, standing behind the bar. And the Eagles, they were called Eagle. And David Geffen in Los Angeles put them together and didn't want anyone in LA to see them until they'd woodshedded for a bit, till they were just perfect. So we sent them out to Colorado where, you know, us chimpanzees wouldn't know the difference. I think they got $500 for the week. And there were no more than 50 people in there at any one juncture. And they sat at the bar and told me how famous they were going to be. Just arrogant guys.
I think I've played Tulagi's in every band I've ever been with. I mean, the Kings have played Tulagi's, Spoons played Tulagi's, Rosewood Canyon played Tulagi's, Magic Music played Tulagi's. Yeah, it was, you kind of had to do it.
Stephen Stills was living in Gold Hill. In fact, he used to have a yellow Mercedes semi-truck with a sound system that was as good as any studio in the world.
Stephen used to come down from Gold Hill and attend the occasional show at Tulagi.
And we'd all be in awe when he'd drive through town in his Mercedes four-wheel drive truck, which always broke down.
Used to schlep it around town. That's when you'd know Stephen was in town and on the prowl. But he had a real good time up at Gold Hill. If you recall his very first solo album with Love the One You're With on it, that picture of him with his acoustic guitar out in the snow, shot right on his front porch, basically. But he volunteered for the Gold Hill Fire Department, was one of those guys. You know, a real Joe Civic, that Steve Stills.
Caribou Ranch, you were taken care of first class. And all you have to do is walk from your place to the studio.
The best story I was ever privy to came courtesy of Bernie Taupin, who was up there when Elton John was recording his great trilogy of albums, Rock of the Westies, the obviously named Caribou, all done up at the ranch. And he said there was more snow inside the cabins than outside at that time. He recalled that Stevie Wonder gave him a ride in a Jeep from his cabin down to the studio. And he was so high that he didn't even question it at the time. Looking back at it, he realized that Stevie must have really practiced, with somebody getting him on the trail just so that he could do it without flinching. And he did, and Bernie didn't even notice.
It was a wild scene. There was the Karmazong people were all around. They were nuts. There was the SDP people. There was the whole hippie scene. There was the Carnival Cafe. And there was all of these musicians wrapped around the Carnival Cafe. It was an amazing time. And that's only part of it. I mean, there was stuff on the hill going on with, Stevie Abo and the Pirates. There was all the stuff going on up at the Pioneer Inn.
The Red Lion Inn, that's where all the musicians and all the drug dealers ate. They were the only ones who could afford Boulder's cheapiest restaurant. I always remember that Joe Walsh had the first $1,000 bill anyone had ever seen, That was rock and roll.
Around the same time, there's a tremendous influence called KFML, freeform radio. That had a lot to do with revolution. This is all quietly revolution, what we're talking about. This is not just trends. This was really shift in music and freedom associated with music.
There was everything, and the local bands were playing. There were lots of places to play. There were all these little honky-tonks, and all the restaurants had music, and the hotels. Shannon's personified drug, sex, and rock and roll. Let's put it that way. And it was, wooden floors, beer, smelling of beer and cigarettes. Your feet would stick to the floor in some spots, and just outrageously drunk, and everybody was stoked up in there all the time. And it was so, the people who know Shannon's, when you say Shannon's, they go, Shannon's.
I arrived here about 15 minutes ago, and I'd like to say that this place evinces a certain visceral greasiness that is not altogether unattractive.
Through until probably the early 80s, it was like there was one big band at Boulder that had interchangeable parts.
The jamming mentality was like, yeah, come on, one jam, let's jam.
I used to get called all the time, hey, our guitar player, broke his hand. Can you play with us for this weekend? Sure.
It's really incestuous. It was one of the cool things about the Boulder scene. There's an old Audience magazine, if you look at the cover, and I was sick that day. I was hungover is what I was. So stoned I couldn't get out of bed. And the old Audience magazine, it's the whole Boulder scene. There was the music store, Warner's, as it was called, on Broadway. And it was a little hole in the wall, but you'd walk in there and Jock Bartley would be sitting and jamming with Tommy Bolin. People would either hang out there or they'd hang over at Nick the Greek's. And in fact, Jock worked the counter for a while at Nick the Greek's.
But one of the first things I encountered when I came down to Pearl Street, this was before the mall was there, was Nick the Greek's music. And on one side of the store was Indian jewelry and rugs. And on the other side was some of the best vintage guitars and Les Pauls and acoustic instruments I'd ever seen. Nick the Greek was in there in a pair of white earth shoes with hair down to his waist, with a concha belt on, a big Indian concha belt. Jock was behind the counter with hair down to his toes. And in and out of the store, you'd see Joe Walsh coming in and out of there, Stephen Stills, Tommy Bolin.
But yeah, the word was out about Colorado. It was a pretty hip place to hang out.
It was like a mecca. You could just, it was like the whole vibe was you could just start anything up in Boulder.
I mean, it was alive and hot. And the three studios were making a living, Mountaineers, North Star, and Caribou. Everybody thought it was going to explode.
There's a guy up there playing saxophone. And I couldn't quite get an angle on him, but he had this half a beard. Like a beard growing out of half of his face. Then the next afternoon, I'm down at the band shell. It was this rock and roll band. I think it was Tim Goodman. Up there's this saxophone player. He's got half a beard. Same guy. And within, another 48-hour period, I'm in some club, and there's this guy playing jazz with half a beard. Now, it wasn't until, you know, a while later when I moved here and knew it that I knew it was Fly McLeod.
Fall of '65, there I am at the music school. Was either